Thank you all for coming and for sticking around. Thank you for all the participants and panelists and moderators. This has been an extraordinary session. This particular panel is titled The Order of Things, Shaping a Photography Museum for the 21st Century. And I'll just read you the brief statement that we created. The Walther Collection was founded in 2010 with the express purpose of providing a research base for the study of photography and an educational forum for public engagement through international exhibitions, symposia, and publishing. Building on the collection's inherent strengths in African and Asian photography, the Walther Collection staff has worked in collaboration with a constituency of leading curators and scholars to shape a groundbreaking artistic program and to enhance the growing collection. Taking the extraordinary development and implementation of the Walther Collection as a case study, this panel considers the special requirements and responsibilities of building an engaging and mobile museum of photography for the 21st century. And I just want to say at the outset a few things about that premise, and then we will have a conversation among these panelists who are all former staff members of the Walther Collection. So as opposed to the other panels, which were maybe a bit more theoretical or analytical, this is really about the machine that Arthur Walther created to accomplish the bold tasks before us. And I say that in relation to this book cover, which is the catalog for an exhibition that I worked on at the Walther Collection. And I always think of the order of things as a little bit in quotes, because really, Arthur Walther has always been about disordering things and putting them back together, as Ai Weiwei does here with this Chinese vase. The Walther Collection is very much a unique and radical museum, built in a neighborhood aspiring to a sort of domestic scale rather than a vast scale, as many museums of the past few decades, and providing a clear space for exhibitions, but also for research and scholarship, and most importantly, to my mind, for critical thinking, for bringing questions to those objects, as in Black Photo Album Santumofking. Interrogating these works as if they were contemporary, even if they're historical. So Arthur, from the start, brought together not only Okwui and Wezor, but many of the panelists who we've seen and staff members here to bring new thoughts to bear on the idea of the museum, which over this exact period was as much in transition as the whole thinking about art history or the history of photography. Publications were a clear part of that program from the beginning because it was not about hoarding that knowledge or maintaining a static collection, but about setting in motion a dialogue, not only between the artists and the curators, but between a much larger public, which could be reached through publications, through the internet, through panels and symposia, which the Walther Collection was really pioneering in organizing internationally, focusing on questions about identity and its impact and importance in global photography. I also think that the studio space in Chelsea in New York City was really important as a kind of experimental laboratory to bring together people and ideas about photography. And we did a series of exhibitions on vernacular photography, personal photography, which highlighted one of the great triumphs of the Walther Collection, which is bringing serious critical attention to bear on underrepresented aspects of the history of photography previously. And we end with this great image from Sandrine's exhibition, The Way She Looks, which was, to my mind, an important curatorial intervention in the collection because Sandrine came in from the outside and built her own theoretical model from the materials available in the collection. What I want to do on this panel really is to ask some fundamental questions about how people inside the institution, working day to day with the archive and with the artists and with the collectors, thought about what they were doing and how they conceptualized it in new and different ways. Because clearly, from my perspective, this was a new kind of museum. And the revolutionary aspects of the Walther Collection as an intervention in the history of museums, I think, is an important part to pick up on. And Christopher, I want to turn to you first as what I regard as a scholar of museums. I still turn to and assign your classic article about the Museum of Modern Art as the judgment seat of photography, where Remy's now working. And I just wonder if you could say a few words about how you see the radical break that the Walther Collection initiated.
Okay. Well, I think probably the best way to start the discussion is by placing the Walther Collection in the very important movement that began probably 25 or 30 years ago, when private collectors increasingly decided to stop donating individual works or large parts of their collection holdings to the large museums like the Metropolitan, MoMA, and so on, and instead to start building their own spaces where they could determine the best way to display their collection, create a relation with audiences in different ways through public programming, through book publications, scholarly symposia. I think there still is a great lack of research into this, I think what we just called the revolution of the private collectors museum around the world. And I think that's where you want to start to try to understand the contributions of the Walther Collection. There have been a number of really innovative and interesting tweakings of the model of a private museum over the last decade or so, and I've had the privilege of knowing and following closely not only what Arthur has been doing, but I will mention two other private collectors who I think have shown the same sort of experimental attitude that Arthur has shown. The first is a New York collector. He passed away several years ago. You knew him, Howard Stein, who, like Arthur, spent his working career in the financial world. And during that time, he started building a corporate collection for Dreyfus Investments. When he retired in his mid-70s, he then started a private foundation, The Joy of Giving Something, which was always considered, I always thought of that as an ironic title because Howard never really gave anything away. He was always getting as much as he gave. But that was a collection that never, it was an enormous collection of 19th century and 20th century photography. Howard worked with a network of scouts and sources around the world. He himself had a strong aesthetic background. He had studied violin at Juilliard before he went into the financial world. Howard would make his own photo books of works from the picture collection and lay them out and come up with sequences. And he would share those ideas with individual curators. And those curators would then come up with a concept for shows and take them to larger institutions. The Joy of Giving Something collection never had a public exhibition space. Howard was not interested in that. He really partnered on short-term projects with major institutions everywhere. And that's how I met him. But he did have an enormous publications program, and that was really in his later years the main focus of his interest and energy, of finding different ways to organize the works in the collection and to brainstorm with curators from many different backgrounds. The other collector I will mention in passing is not specifically a photography collector, but he is a major collector of Chinese contemporary art based in Paris, Silva Levy, who comes from a real estate background, if I remember correctly. Silva has established a set of ground rules for his collection that I've always found very interesting. He has a maximum number of works, around 300, that will be in the collection at any moment. Every year he rotates 15% of the collection out and uses the funds from the sale of those works to buy new works. He really wants his collection to be contemporary and to the moment, and he says he knows that that means that he has to make a commitment to making ongoing purchases for the collection year in and year out. He has also been a strong innovator in terms of presentation. He decided he did not want to build and maintain a physical exhibition space, so he has put together a remarkable technological team, and they have built an online virtual exhibition space, which has been up and running for 10 years or more, and which constantly becomes upgraded so that it's almost like a video game at this point. You create your own avatar, you can navigate through the exhibition spaces, encounter the sculptural works and walk around them or fly around them. You can watch the videos in the collection from inside this virtual space. And as he tells the story, within the next 2 or 3 years, he will have a 3D virtual reality version of this museum, which will make a different kind of experience possible and will allow individuals to come together there in the guise of their archives for scholarly purposes, for symposia, and so on. So this is, again, I think, a really innovative, experimental approach to what a museum can do here in the 21st century. We'll see how it works out, but he is a very intelligent, not only collector, but someone who is really taking some chances on what you can do with an online virtual collection space. The Walther Collection, in that light, distinguishes itself for its continuing emphasis on making possible the best kind of physical experience of the artworks themselves, without the kind of technological intermediaries that I've just mentioned. The Walther Collection, with its ongoing emphasis on new scholarship, its constant reaching out to young scholars, productive scholars around the world, and to emerging curators, again, it sounds like it would be something easy to do, but we all know that that requires a lot of work, a lot of conversations, and a lot of winnowing out in terms of who can really make a substantial contribution to the ongoing scholarship that will keep the artworks alive and provide fresh perspectives for new generations. So that.
Well, I think the the point that you make about private collections being a really extraordinary new phenomenon within the museum world is a really important one. And as we've seen with the Walther Collection, one of the things that often makes them more experimental and innovative is that they have a small staff, they can make decisions quickly, they aren't overburdened by bureaucracies. And Maria, I know you're working with another private collection, Maria, formerly the director of the Walther Collection in Ulm, and now working with another private collection.
But maybe first, I want to come back to your initial question, because I think one of the most innovative moves of the Walther Collection was to adopt what is called visual culture in the humanities at a very early point to exhibition making and to collecting, and even at a point when visual culture hasn't fully arrived in the humanities itself. So I think this is a very important point. And in the last years, this has changed a little bit, and here comes again maybe the connection to MoMA, because MoMA is the big institutional tanker and used to be maybe the collection that formed the canon of what is photography with a cultural value, as you said, the judgment seat. And now, in my opinion, this also has changed a little bit with Clément Géroux, recently have been appointed the new head of the photography collection. And Clément Géroux, I think many of you know him, is very well known for his interest in visual culture, has been publishing and exhibiting about the images of concentration camps, the visual culture around 9/11. So the Walther Collection was ahead of the crowd many years, and now the others follow. So this is what I just wanted to say. Yeah.
I just want to riff on what Marie. Hello? Okay. I think I want to add to that. There's something I find really beautiful about what the collection does, not only because it sustains itself, right, in its exhibitions, its programming, its publications, but also, as you've said so astutely, it's something that is clearly really engaged and close to, right, of course, the market, but also museums, right? So it's that Arthur is on the board of the ICP at a time when he's building the Walther Collection and thinking through what its mandate will be. I mean, for me, I love when I see, actually, another anecdote maybe to share. I was taking our contemporary group with A.C. Hutchins, who is a phenomenal collector in his own right. And we were walking through MoMA PS1's Greater New York last month, and there were two works from the Walther Collection by Rotimi Fani Kayode that had been loaned to be included because the curators of Greater New York right now thought it was relevant to include a work that has been in the collection for so long. And in the terms of thinking about, right, museum institutions catching up to the Walther Collection, AC turned to me and he said, you know, I first saw these works in a fantastic project space in Chelsea. Do you know what that place was called? And I said, yes, I do. Absolutely. I know those works very well. I know that space very well. And he was astounded when I told him, this is how I know those works, right? So I love the idea of the Walther Collection not only being a place that sustains itself, but is a place that does set the tone for other institutions, right, for other curators. And the fact that it's so good in terms of leaving the trace, and maybe Brendan can talk about, right, the place of publications, is that those lives continue outside the exhibitions too.
But that relationship with other institutions, as, say, between the Walther Collection and the Museum of Modern Art, do you see that as a collaborative one or an antagonistic one, or, you know, I always think of the Walther Collection as kind of light years ahead in terms of thinking about the apparatus itself, like how people work within the space, how the collaboration that takes place between artists, curators, staff, collectors, you know, very, very different than you would encounter in these larger, I would say, bureaucratically oriented institutions.
May I? Yeah.
Sure.
Because I'm now working in a very conservative field again, very structured, very bureaucratic, and I'm not sure whether these places can ever really catch up to private collections like the Walther Collection is, because if you work in a classical museum, there are all these obligations, there are first of all, funding is a thing, a big thing. And then, of course, there are the numbers you have to bring, numbers concerning visitors. So, of course, you then curate exhibitions, you do projects that do interest the public now, but you never think of what would interest the public tomorrow, what is now not in the scope of the broader audiences. And that is something Arthur just did out of a personal interest very early on, because he wanted to see things he didn't see somewhere else. And many museums, I don't know whether you agree, but that is my personal perspective. They don't look for things that aren't in the broader public and discussion at a certain point. They just try to, I don't know, offer a platform for current discussions, but not for the discussions of tomorrow.
That's a really interesting point, having to do with relevance and immediacy. And again, this has to do with the capacity of smaller, often individual collector museums to adapt and to show things quickly, develop exhibitions and even publications quickly, and to respond to an audience, really to carry on a dialogue with the audience in a lot of ways. So it's not just you're creating something within an institution that and then you show to the audience. It's like there is an ongoing dialogue, which often occurs through direct events, panels, symposia, special events, but also publications. And Brendan, I know you've had a lifelong interest in publications.
Yeah.
And we're very involved in sort of setting the style for a lot of the original Walther Collection publications.
But I want to go back slightly just and tell a personal story, which I think is somewhat connected to the value, perhaps what we might call the social value or the community value of this collection. So in 2007, I was in New York. I had recently moved to New York, and I'm like many people who recently moved to New York and who are young. I was working at a restaurant because I had to pay my bills, and I was applying to graduate school at NYU, and I wanted to do my master's in African and African American studies. Of course, my family were like, "What are you doing?" But I had an idea, and sometimes at the restaurant I would talk to people who were coming through, and one evening it was kind of slow, and I met this woman customer came through. This restaurant was actually near NYU, so it was very normal for students both to work there and for professors to have lunch there. And this woman came in. I don't think she was an academic, and we were talking, and she said, "Oh, what are you doing?" Because if you're a young person working at a restaurant, you probably have another life that you're imagining for yourself. And I said, "Oh, I'm applying to graduate school. I want to do a degree in African and African American studies." And this woman said, "You will never get a job. You will never get a job in that field." And she said it with such, she did not pause, it with the arrogance and the crystalline certainty with which she said that. And her remark stayed on my mind for a long time, because I actually worked at the Museum for African Art in New York while I was in graduate school. And I was in London in 2010. And I'm so happy that you have, Brian, ended your visual presentation with this image by Seydou Keita, because I was obsessed with Seydou Keita from the time I was in college. And I went to an opening at Jack Bell Gallery, who still has his gallery in African art in London, and he was presenting an exhibition by Seydou Keita. And there I met René Moussaï and Emma at Autograph, and we were talking, and René said, "Oh, what are you doing in London? What are you here for?" And I said, "Oh, I just finished graduate school. I don't really have a plan." And René invited me to come and be an intern at at Autograph, and working on James Barner's exhibition. I'm coming around to the story. So I worked with René. I worked with René on James Barner's retrospective at Autograph, which was the primary text, because that was the first really major important exhibition on James, and there was writing, and there was your newspaper that was so important. And when I came back to New York, I was unemployed, and I was trying to find a job, and I applied for more than 100 jobs. I went through this very strange interlude of self-questioning, and I saw an ad for an internship at the Walther Collection, and I remembered that Renee had gone to the grand opening in 2010 of the Walther Collection, and shortly thereafter, this gigantic book arrived on your desk, and we were all like, what is this collection? This is amazing. And I saw that ad, and I said, oh, I have to have this job. I mean, I had to have it. It was the point at my career in which I thought, oh, it's not just about being in the library and writing a paper. These are artworks and artists I want to work with. And so that point of, what I'm trying to say is that this collection created a space for people who have very niche interests and passions to actually make a career and to become, in my case, I'm an editor now, I mean, to take something that was highly theoretical, working on it in the basement of the library, and to work with Samuel Fosso, or to work with Santa Muffiking, or work with people who were not just figments of one's imagination, you know, as a graduate student, but in life. So I think that, and I don't mean to say that to be sentimental, but only to say that the one aspect of a private collection is to create capacity around very specialized interests that then you realize that there is community and there are people who want to learn through visiting exhibitions, through reading, or through public programs. So I wanted to mention that. We'll come back to publications in the next round, Brian.
It does get back to this question of community, because, and audience, if you want to call it that, because what you're talking about is opening up a space, and suddenly you discover there are a lot of people that want to join you in that space that didn't have a physical or even a psychological space to join with one another in a maybe neglected field. And so this certainly has provided that space not only in New York but internationally to talk about contemporary African art and photography and Asian photography in unique ways. But Maria, you were going to say a little bit about the private collection that you work with now and how that is similar or different to your experience with the Walther Collection.
I'm not sure if I really can tell you a lot about it, because my experience is that it's quite similar, at least from the structural side, because it's also a very small team with flat hierarchies. And what is also similar, you always have this person in the center with a very special interest, and you try to do your best, bring this to the public and do programs and exhibitions that deal with this special idea of the collector. But this is also, I think, the chance of the private collection, because as I think Oloremi said, or it was Danila, I forgot about it, is that as a private collection, you're not funded by public money, for example, and you're not kind of have kind of politics in the way, and you really can pursue your own interest. And and that's be very innovative, and
Right, and so often these private collections are rather specialized, niche collections. But Renee, Remy, you were starting to say about how the canon, the traditional representation of visual culture is represented in larger museums. And do you see something like the smaller or private collections or private museums affecting the way of thinking at larger museums and this kind of canon formation, or breaking that apart, providing such a challenge to it that larger institutions can't quite adapt or assimilate?
Yeah, I mean, I have a short answer and a long answer to that. The short answer I would say is some would consider the fact that I now work at MoMA being evidence of the impact of places like the Walther Collection, because the significant chunk of my curatorial experience took place here, my formative understandings. So I would say, right, it's hard for me to think about it as completely in tension if someone like me can move between these two spaces. And then I would say maybe the longer answer is a little bit like Brendan, evidenced by my entry into the Walther Collection. And I shared yesterday sort of like what it meant for me to walk into the project space even before I had thought, okay, I need to work here. It was kind of the thing that made me feel, yes, I need to be here. It was not just, right, this unbelievable collection, but that I could be in a space where a fantastic exhibition, right, of Samuel Fosso's work could be taking place in New York, that many people would say is a museum quality exhibition, that had the launch of a book project for Zanelli Mochole. Both, right, those presences are in that space. And hilariously, I remember it was one of the first times I met Sable Elise Smith, who's now both on the list for the Venice Biennial and in the Whitney Biennial, who at that time was working at the Studio Museum in Harlem. So it was it was a real site where people came together. And so for me, it was, I need to be part of this. But I would say the reason why I really, beyond my passion around the space, was a conversation I had with a person who was my mentor then and continues to be, who's the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, Thelma Golden. And I went to her and I told her what my interests were, that I was interested in the history of photography, I wanted to be a curator, and I wanted to focus on the African continent. And she said, the only place in New York that you were gonna get that experience is at the Walther Collection. Go there with your CV and tell them I sent you. And that's how I met Brendan. And so
Yes, I was going to say that, so one day I was working at the desk and Remy came in and we started talking and then she said, oh, Thelma Golden sent me. And I said, well, okay, in that case. And then she became exactly. I needed an intern and then the rest, now she's at MoMA. So it's like the rest is history. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, but I guess the reason I lay out the short and the long answer to those questions is to say I don't know if it's fully about attention insofar as kind of what Daniela has provided, which is that collections like the Walther Collection offer us a way to think beyond the present moment, which bureaucratic large-scale institutions are just not nimble enough to do. However, it doesn't mean that they aren't in the same world. They aren't staffed by people who are in conversation. So there are ways to bridge those institutional differences, right, whether that's through staffing, whether it's through programming, whether it's being in the same room. I feel like it's generative.
That is exactly what I was going to talk about next, which is the generative aspect of a community. So staff working together in collaboration with others, artists, curators, and so forth, and creating new ideas out of that. And a lot is said retrospectively about the effect of the Walther Collection in changing perceptions of the history of photography or being more inclusive about works from Asia or Africa. But I'm curious about this sense of being in the machine and understanding whether you felt you were changing something or whether it's just going by too fast to even think about that.
We didn't know what we are doing.
Exactly.
I think they say like a year in real time and a year in the Walther Collection is different because you are really producing so much at the same time. Yeah.
So, I mean, we're mostly busy doing customs, doing a lot of emails, juggling things, many things at the same time. But I had a key moment in Mexico because we did this 2 major exhibitions of African and Asian photography there. And we exhibited the ethnographic images, the really difficult ones, but in a very certain context and very contextualized. And I did a few tours with Mexican students, and so many of them told me, oh my God, we have similar images at home in our albums, but we never questioned them. We never thought this is something that should be considered critically and that this might be a fiction invented by someone else. And so that was for me and I thought we talked about this too, that was a key moment for me. I'm really noticing, okay, that is not only important in the context of the United States or Europe, speaking about the past, but it also sparks to other continents and countries, and creating, or how is it called, sparking dialogues there, new dialogues and new stories of how to deal with the past.
Well, I remember Oakley saying specifically that he thought of the Walther Collection as a platform for the development of critical thinking about photography, which is a very different concept than a conventional museum. And it involves creating a space or a site, as you say, to bring people together to initiate that dialogue around images and ideas. Christopher, about the question of changing the perspective of global history of photography, how do you feel the Walther Collection has made an intervention?
Well, if I go to the library at New York University now, I can see probably a couple of shelves filled with, well, they're sagging under the weight of some of the larger publications, and they seem to be worn with use, so they are clearly attracting a readership. And I would say it's the strength of the publications program beyond the extraordinary exhibitions that really has sort of fueled the outreach of the ideas generated by the Walther Collection.
Right, and I think that's been a kind of unique demonstration of the agility and strength of these smaller institutions to produce publications that are rigorously researched and well thought out and engage some leading scholars and curators in the world. So Brendan, there's your opening to talk about publications.
Yeah, publications, but first of all, I want to just talk about communications a little bit, because well, as Remy said, Thelma Golden was correct. There was nowhere in New York except the Walther Collection if you wanted to seriously engage with African photography. And I should say, at the time that I worked at the Walther Collection, the major focus was African photography. There were other projects during Remy's time and other things that happened at the project space. So that was my purview. But Arthur was very ambitious and setting a standard at the beginning that we would be getting press for the exhibitions. And I think it's really important to underscore that. And when you're talking about being inside the machine, like, we routinely had our exhibitions reviewed in the New York Times, in the New Yorker, sometimes in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, major press, and that created capacity. People would be reading to see what exhibition they might see on the weekend and coming. And that was really important because we were this small gallery on the 7th floor, but we always had a unique program that was worthy and notable to be written about in the press. And I think that's, like, maybe seems a little insidery or promotional, but the communications part of it is so elemental, I would say. And, you know, when we have had, and it serves as a record now because the space is unfortunately closed, and when you have a New York Times review of Santa Mofokeng, a New York Times review of Rotimi Fanakeori, Samuel Fosso, I mean, who knows when any New York institution is going to come up to speed and do sustained, meaningful projects like that. So having that element of communications out there is important. And the second thing is in communications in terms of engagement. When we did Tamar's show, Distance and Desire, we had 5 public programs in the space, and we knew what they were going to be. We had a little reader where you can sign up for all of the different programs. And so again, that idea of creating capacity was essential, yeah.
Did the same thing occur in Germany?
This was a very different situation because the Walther Collection is located very remotely, I would say, in a suburban small town in Bullerfingen, close to Ulm, in Neu-Ulm. And there is a very different situation because you don't have this big audience that just passes by, but I think it needs a lot of work to get people there. Even with a very simple problem, public transport, it doesn't exist any public transport. So at the beginning, we tried. I just can talk for the first years. Maybe Daniela can tell something else. We tried to establish, for example, programs for schools But it was really, really difficult because it was not possible for the schools to come over because there was no public transport, and to get a bus to bring them over was too expensive. So you face very different problems in this different location, yeah. But I think the combination was great of on one hand, being in this suburban area where I really think it's very important to have cultural institutions to stimulate the cultural life there and make connections to the people there and institutions there. But on the other hand, the project space is kind of was the international window of the Walther Collection, and I think this was very important at that time to build up the visibility of the collection. And I'm also a little bit sad that the project space is closed now, but maybe the Walther Collection is big enough to just operate alone from Bullerfingen. I don't know, yeah.
Was that your experience, Danielle?
Yes, of course it was. There was still no public transport when I took over. But Maria laid out a great foundation. So, I mean, when I started, the basic steps had already happened. So people in the surroundings in the region knew about the Walther collections, and we had teachers and school classes that stopped by on a very regular basis, because for especially young adults, photography is something very natural. It's different than going to an art museum, because they know what happens there. They know things can be staged and that this is not the reality. So that was, I feel, very successful, and we had regular hours from Thursday to Sunday. And what was very nice and interesting, from time to time we had just visitors from Paris, from Italy, who were traveling, but I mean, they went to Heidelberg and then to Bullerfing just to see the collection, because they had read somewhere about this very special place, and they stayed for the whole afternoon and just took their time, rested in the garden. So it's a very different experience compared to normal museums. We had no entry fees, so I mean, that was something very crazy. We did these regular public tours through the exhibition, and Bullerfing is really small, 1,000 inhabitants or something, and many of the neighbors just brought every visitor they had to the collection, and they gave tours because they joined the tours. And at some point I just thought, okay, why am I here? So, and I think that is something very special, because many of these people were older, not well traveled or so, but they knew about African photography, they knew about Asian photography. Of course, only certain things, but there was an interest that was sparked. And I mean, when I worked at the Walther Collection, I never compared the project space and the campus in Bullerfing directly, because I feel the project space was a kind of laboratory where artists were invited, where ideas were discussed with curators, and where something was developed, and that might have not been in like the super perfect shape, but then with those huge premises in Bullerfing, you cannot make mistakes in presentation. So this was the space, like a showroom, where you really, really did the fine-tuning. And we had the time doing that there, because we had sometimes we had crowds of visitors, but not like this machine going on of people coming every day, every time from the morning to the evening. And I feel that was really a luxury, a big privilege.
And if I could just ask you one more question about Bullerfingen, what about the experience of the different sites there? I mean, I always felt like that was a very unique experience, these domestic scale spaces, in addition to the kind of white cube.
Yeah, because you could just display the work in a surrounding that kind of complemented the work, because you had no pressure to put like tiny things in those huge halls. There was a space that was more intimate, more protected, and especially photos of difficult content, I feel they need a protected space too, something that kind of protects the images, like a bit at least. And we had all the opportunities there. And concerning the touring exhibitions, this was very helpful because we exactly could tell the museums in advance what would work and what probably would be catastrophic in combination, in placement, in layout, in installation.
I want to return to the question of publications again, because one of the things that fascinates me about
This
it
time I'll actually answer it.
is that, you know, the way people came to it with different levels of skill and training to produce these incredibly rigorous, voluminous books and catalogs, incredibly well-researched, detailed, error-free, and how that was possible. So, Brendan, can you tell us your experience of trying to put together those books, often on a short schedule?
A very, I don't want to say impossibly short, but because we made it, but it was a lightning speed. So the first catalog was Events of the Self, which Oakley edited and which arrived on René's desk in London, and and I think it must weigh 6 pounds or something like that, was an enormous homage to the collection, but with a very powerful piece of writing by Oakley and then others, and I think that set the pace for what those books might be. If you have the slide with the 3-book set, which continued with Corinne's exhibition Appropriated Landscapes, which Remy and I were talking about, includes a number of really fantastic portraits of artists by Bronwyn Lavalloon, which is a very kind of rare format or style for an exhibition catalog, to do literary portraits of artists as opposed to interviews or what have you. But the catalog, where I feel like, which was my kind of crucible experience as an editor, and also just learning how to make a book, was with Tamar, because with Distance and Desire and with 19th century photography, first of all, the level of scholarship and the ambition that Tamar brought to that project was formidable, but also there was a real sense of responsibility that there had to be a community of voices contributing to this. And I think it was a very difficult project because it was asking primary research from people who are stars in their field to contribute. But I think these catalogs have been so important, and then, of course, the monographs, going back to the idea at the previous panel about primary text, because in many cases they were a platform for an artist's voice that hadn't been elaborated upon, and the monographs speak to the thematic catalogs in an important way. And what I mean by that is that we have the frame of African art covering these 3 volumes here, but a monographic study of an artist, Joe Ratcliffe, would be one example, Guy Tillam. Then it's like you go deep into all of their series, their voices are heard, and for posterity, because this is a private collection that is not the same as the collection at the Museum of Modern Art that one assumes will be around for decades and decades. I mean, this is a testament to an exhibition that happened at this moment in time, in a very personal family collection, that it doesn't have the same institutional, what would be the word? It doesn't have the same relationship to the artwork that an institution might have because it's in the possession of a family. So I think these exhibition catalogs have served as primary texts and have also trained, I think, a number of us in making books, in working with Steidl, so the gold standard there, and also in figuring out how to create history, how to create historical accounts of this moment.
Well, you also bring up another point about the Walther Collection, which is, instead of choosing 1 or 2 photographs by each individual artist, it goes very deep into individual monographic collections that can then be explored and represented in these individual volumes, which I think is kind of special and maybe even unique. Just the capacity to show so many works from the collection by a single artist. Christopher. Well, in thinking about the Walther Collection as a representative museum or a radical deviation from the history of museums, how do you think of the Walther Collection will change the trajectory of future museums? Or what do you think is the future of museums now? Is it more virtual? Is it more personal? Is it smaller? Is it more dispersed geographically? Anyone?
Big questions.
Remy?
This is a question for Remy, actually, so maybe I'll tee it up for you, because I think one way of thinking about that is, first of all, Remy working at the Museum of Modern Art and causing paradigm shifts and influencing ideas around collecting, publishing at a major institution that is the judgment seat in one place, but it's also a place where millions of tourists, art lovers, go every year. And I think that, as you mentioned before, like our training at the Walther Collection is absolutely integral to the work that you have just only started and no doubt will continue. And in my case at Aperture, I mean, we have done major articles about artists who are in the Walther Collection in non-geographically aligned projects. I mean, we did a piece about Teo Eshetu last year in a very kind of imaginative project about cosmology. So I think that there are paradigm shifts that are happening because of our experiences, but I don't want to be too obsessed with the mainstream or the institutional, but I do think that the work that Remy is already doing at MoMA is essential for what we're talking about with the future of museums: inclusivity, representation, and opening our eyes to other histories of photography. But like no pressure or anything.
What you're saying, though, is suggested because it opens the possibility that maybe the museum isn't a centralized space or an institution even, but a set of practices that could be dispersed across a wide range of activities.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you, Brendan. That was so generous. But I think, perhaps I wonder if the way to also think about the Walther Collection's like challenge to institutions or the future of museum institutions is to think about it through traces. So it's thinking about what are the practices, what are the sets of knowledge, what are the reference points that the people, right, because institutions, yes, they're institutions, but they're also people. So if the people who are in these institutions come and I say, okay, well, yes, Cindy Sherman's important, but Samuel Foster is more important to me. And I say that to my colleagues, and that's the first thing they hear out of my mouth. It's a challenge, right? To me, it's real, but that's the challenge that comes from being trained in a place like this, from understanding what the histories are, what the theoretical challenges, tensions, questions that face our field, like full stop, of course, across right, publications, whether you're working within different kinds of collecting institutions or not. Yeah, to me, I guess I'm more interested in that kind of provocation that the Walther Collection does and what it allows through its traces or the people that come through it, than perhaps what it does like as an structural or institutional riposte.
Maybe there's one thing I want to add, is that maybe the future museum, and this is something one can take up from the Walther Collection, should be a place of debate and not just looking. And maybe this gap between the producers of knowledge or exhibitions are on the one side, and then there are the visitors on the other side, and they shall be, should learn and be educated by what the other side does. I think this is kind of outdated. There needs to be more interaction and more fluidity between these two people. And the Walther Collection, I think, a very important tool starting with this, and we're already taking part in that, is that of the conference. And this, I think, is also a tool that was not so common in museums at that time. It came from the academic background. And what I like very much about this tool is that the knowledge is at the same time produced but shared. And a huge variety of people is included in this production of knowledge. So it's not so easy anymore to kind of condense everything to kind of hegemonial line or look. And I think this is very interesting to take up for future institutions. Yeah,
I think maybe to echo that, and perhaps a little bit also of what Daniela had said, from a practical perspective too, curatorial practice in the Walther Collection is it's not specialized in the way it can become, right, in a bureaucratic or hierarchical structure as one expects. And so it means, right, that if you're thinking about what it means to make an exhibition through the Walther Collection, it means you know your sight lines, and you don't just know your sight lines, you know how to make the sight lines happen. You don't just know what the works are on the checklist, you know what the dimensions are on the checklist, how to unpack them if need be, how to open the crate, right, how to be there at the dock and double check. And you yourself, as someone who comes through this space, knows how to make things happen. And I feel that kind of self-determination in some ways that is necessitated by a structure where you are collaborating continuously, you are in relation to others, but it also means you can make things happen. It's not an interdependency based on hierarchy, it's an interdependency based on collaboration and openness, right? I think that's useful.
Good. Well, thank you. Questions from the audience? We have one in the front row.
Forgive me, it's not really a question, but it's a continuation of what both Daniela and Maria were saying.
About your exhibition.
Because, I mean, I think that, you know, you look at a product like Distance and Design, you see this finished thing, this polished thing. But the process which produced that, and this is really a testimony to Arthur's incredible generosity and openness. I mean, this came out of so many conversations and, in fact, a conference, a 2-day conference, which was a collaboration with NYU and Deb Willis, who came in as an equal partner at that point, at the moment of the conversation. And Deb and I put that conference together over phone calls and whatever, working with Brendan and others, Maria, etc., at the time, with Arthur's input continuously. And I mean, you're working there in a case, literally with a box of objects about which nothing has been written. We had to think, who in the world are we going to invite to talk about this and to talk about that? How are we going to be adequate to those historical objects? What can we draw on? And Arthur brought everyone to New York, and that's why this New York space was so incredibly important. I mean, it was much more than an exhibition space, as you say. It was a hub for thinking. And then working in collaboration with a university like NYU was also very important. And I think bringing the university as another partner in the knowledge production game here with the museum and with the private collection, etc., is a crucial component for that. And then what was so amazing at that event was that we really didn't know what was going to come out of that conference. And then after everyone had given their papers, then became the agonizing task of thinking, well, which didn't we like and which did we like and who were we going to disinvite and who didn't send their text and who didn't play the game and do what they said they were going to do. So there were, 20 or 30 papers or whatever it was. But the agonizing process of then out of that, crafting a book, working, you know, with Brendan, etc., to edit it. So what comes out of that is a couple of years, I don't know, we did it fast, but it was about a year's work of thinking and whatever. But that is the kind of nimbleness of an institution, or not even an institution, of an outfit like the Walther Collection, which can do that. And I suppose this is a question for you, Arthur. I mean, when you told me that you were closing down New York, of course, I said to you, wow, that's a real pity. And I think all of us feel the sense of loss. We understand from your personal perspective why it didn't work for you anymore. But it was an incredibly generative space for thinking and for the kind of work that goes into making a project like this, which is, you know, exhibition and book and everything else. So it'll be really interesting to see how you can do that without the New York space. And I think, going back to some of the things that people have said, you know, this is going to depend, I suppose, on working with partners and collaborations, yeah, with universities, etc., and museums, and interesting to see what, you know, I mean, yeah, exactly, and to see how this, I suppose it's going to become a peripatetic thing. It's going to move from space to space and live in different, rather than be centered in one location. But I think it's really important to stress the labor that went into making that and the many, many people involved in producing it.
But it's also interesting to hear in that story of yours how the whole process was really invented. Like there wasn't necessarily a model existing. You had to kind of build it and think it through. And then, just sorry to add to that. I mean,
Sorry, as Brendan was saying, the politics of that and the politics of scholarship then become very important because you're dealing with an incredibly fraught archive, something which can produce all kinds of anxieties in all of us. We had to think of the demographic of the participants, of its relationship to African scholarship, of whether this was just going to be a kind of northern produced book that wasn't going to bring proper African collaboration in. And this is another big question, which Arthur and I have been talking about for years, is how is this project going to speak with colleagues in Africa in the long term? And what is it to build that dialogue which has a kind of longevity and a new life and from which we learn? And that was already in place in at this moment, but it's you know, it's an ongoing challenge, I think.
I would, like, as a footnote or like an add to that, I would say that was probably what was really important for us bringing recent histories to Bamako. So like having an exhibition on the African continent where a number of the artists had like called Rencontre home. I mean, François Javier is in the room with us, right, was featured in that exhibition and found that space really important for his career. To be in that space again, I felt was really, yeah, important. But I totally...
I just have to quickly say goodbye. Thank you. Yeah.
I don't know if it's really a question. What I find interesting and what has been said about the foundation is that it's more of a laboratory than of a physical space. While you were talking about what has been produced, excuse me, young people, but you've been, quote unquote, produced as well by the foundation. You started there as intern, etc. Now you're there and spreading the news and the practices and another kind of philosophy. And the other thing as well is that what the old places, the old fat places are discovering now, which is that there might be somebody like you at the MoMA, etc., etc. I mean, this collection started from the beginning. Who do we call to do this and to do that? Which is not obvious to the fat big ones who, I mean, in France, for instance, Beaubourg is discovering that maybe there would be a possibility that, etc., etc. But that was natural, and it gives also another sense of how to do things. And I think that the size allows to be much more efficient. I mean, the size is not the only thing, the philosophy behind it. And yes, I think that we're talking about new technologies, etc. And the fact that when we look at Africa, there's not many places where the collection so far could be seen, but to have some virtual exhibitions that could be sent there, because I think it's always important, I know you all agree on that. It's always important to display things, but it's also important for the people whose story it is told about to see them. We had a great deal of shows dealing with Africa, whatever, and I remember that when we're doing Remix, the different partners said, well, okay, we're doing it here, here, there. I said, yes, but we have to do it in Africa. And I didn't say what for, but it was like, okay, who's going to pay, etc., etc. It was really important for me for this mega show to be seen in Africa, and we managed to bring it in South Africa, and it was really important. So I think that's part, we talk about the future. There's also a virtual tour for places that cannot necessarily get the physicality of it will be important. And what's important also is to keep it like a laboratory. It's a boiling thing when things are happening, discussions are made, etc., etc. And again, it's not the physicality. As for the future, we're here, it was there, it's there, etc., etc. And it's also the beauty of the collection is that it's like a library. So there's so many exhibitions that can be produced out of this body of works out there.
That's right. Other questions, comments, remarks?
Well, Brian, I have a question for you, actually, because we didn't hear from you. You were a curator at ICP and director of exhibitions. So you actually have had both experiences in a very strong way of working within an institution, making brilliant exhibitions that are canonical, certainly now, both as a curator yourself, but also as someone who was overseeing the curatorial agenda at ICP. How has it been for you to go from the institutional position to the more freewheeling, freelancing aspect of working with Arthur on multiple exhibitions, and having known each other now for so long? What do you want to tell us about your perspective?
Well, I would say in a certain sense, the Walther Collection grew out of our joint experience at ICP. I mean, Christopher was working alongside me at ICP, and Oakley came into that mix, and of course, Arthur was a longtime trustee at ICP. So I always felt like the conversation that we had started there and the practices of, generating exhibitions around ideas, really, rather than around objects, was central to the conception of how you develop new ways of critical thinking about visual culture. And, it was a question of I know for Oakley, it was rather like your experience with the Walther Collection, because he said, where else can I do these kinds of exhibitions? Mm-hmm. Who else is receptive to this way of thinking in New York City? Mm-hmm. And there were not many options at that point. And so he kind of jumped into the exhibition program with plenty of ideas. And fortunately, in that case, we had this apparatus of staff members and funding and, an administration that didn't quite know what we were doing. So they let us get away with it. And then Arthur and a few other trustees who really got it and drove the program forward. So to me, working with the Walther Collection was, in fact, very similar to working at ICP. It's like I say, you take these practices to different places where they find fertile ground and opportunities for set amounts of time. It works for 5 or 6 years, and then, it's shut down for one reason or another, and you have to move on to another place. And those kinds of mobile practices, taking advantage of critical opportunities, I think, are really what make the most spectacular and relevant projects of all kinds.
I wanted to add something to that, Brian, because you're tracing a kind of trajectory from ICP as an institution and Arthur's role as a collector, and then as a kind of entrepreneur in this space of making an exhibition that is public facing. And we talk about primary text, the value of insight as a catalog, the value of snap judgments as a catalog, and I think the publishing history at the Walther Collection has blossomed to a point of real accomplishment. And when you get to recent histories, which is just this unbelievably beautiful book full of interviews, full of, I know the primary text was really important to you in that, and the other editors in that exhibition, but I think that is like taking the best of an institution, learning the structures of an institution, and then building that out into a space that is absolutely unique and accomplished. And I think recent histories is the catalog. I didn't work on that, so I'm allowed to use all the superlatives that I want to, but I just think it is like the most tremendous accomplishment in publishing in vis-a-vis this collection. And it is just a gift to the artists who must, I don't want to speak for them, but the sense of belonging. I mean, Francois Xavier, you were part of that project, both in New York and then in Ulm and in publishing, but I should imagine that that is a critical mass, that is a moment of critical mass that's a record of an exhibition. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I would say it was, it's like with every volume, learning from everything that has come before. I think the one thing I would say, a little bit like what we were talking about earlier with Tamar's work, the highest compliment is when you see the relevance of the text beyond the context of which it came, right? So to talk about the fact that I continue to encounter Tamar's essay in like liner notes or footnotes for colleagues and friends, right? But also like the highest compliment one can receive is I had a doctoral candidate colleague who was asking me, oh, you know Mimi Chirono Ngok, do you know what the bibliography is for her? And I said, well, it's thin, there are these things, but the best is Moses Serabiri's essay in Recent Histories, her interview in that book as well, and these can give you, and he's like, yeah, I knew that was what it was gonna be. But, you know, just to think about creating spaces for life, the life of the work to extend.
And seeing it going out into the world and being chosen as one of the best photo books of the year in the New York Times Magazine. I mean, that when we talk about communications, it wasn't just like doing these projects and hoping someone would find them, but it was about ringing the bell and alerting people, and well deserved. I mean, a book like that should be getting all of its laurels. So I'm proud to see the trajectory of the publication program standing as a record for the exhibitions and the public programming of the collection.
Very good. Well, thank you all for participating in this conversation. And of course, thank you to Arthur Walther, who we celebrate this weekend.